Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak at BCWW. I'd like to thank Uni and all the organisers for their passion and all the partners of this amazing event. Thanks to everyone joining us today. I sincerely hope this finds you and your families well. I'm Steve Langdon, the Regional Director for Parrot Analytics, and I'd also like to introduce our Partner Insights Lead in the region, Lisa Pack, who will be co-presenting with me today. Throughout BCWW, you will be taking deep dives into the region's supply of content, including subscriber and revenue information. So Lisa and I thought we would take a different view, a view of how Korean content is being demanded by consumers. After all, content demand is the flywheel that drives the industry that we all love. This year, the top 5 media companies will invest almost $100 billion in content internationally. But locally, we demand even more than that. We demand our cultural stories, our diversity, and our contrasts on screens. And we'd like to understand the mixture for how those go out for international success. The battle that we all fight is the battle for consumers' attention. So we think it's better to fight that battle armed with data. So today's narrative, we'll run through how we uncover total available audiences globally as Parrot. Why is it important and what's the opportunity for Korean content that travels? Then we'll look at what defines whether a hit goes international. And we'll look then at a very successful Korean show that's become a worldwide hit and how we can look at it. So let's get into that. Let's get into it. If we look at what demand is, let's use an illustrative example. These are 3 show launches in the local market of Spain in 2017, 18 and 19. You can see one of these shows on the right-hand side, Money Heist, became an international smash. The other 2 maybe not so much. What's the leading indicator of that? Well, to the left-hand side, you can see the ratings for those 3 shows when they were transmitted. You can see that there was no clear winner of which show was going to be a huge international success. That's when we add our demand metric in. When we add demand, there is one clear leading indicator, and that is that Money Heist is a much bigger hit internationally, because what we do is we measure the demand for these 3 shows on an international level, even though the show might not have been released. So this gives us a very leading indicator of a show that's going to become an international hit. Now, of course, after 1 year, Demand's predicted winner emerged from this battle. Money Heist was clearly the show that became the international smash, and the other 2 shows, maybe not so much. So just an example of how at Parrot we look at leading indicators to find international success, even at a very early stage. We can also use demand to look at the share of original programming within each platform. Now, this is very much a leading indicator of subscriber growth. So what you're seeing here is the share of original programming tentpoles on each one of these networks in APAC. So Netflix will say that they're having a tough few quarters with the pandemic, and we agree the pandemic is definitely tough, but we also see the competition starting to catch up with the share of demand. You can see Disney has certainly grown its demand since it launched in Q1 2020 to when the Marvel machine is now in full gear in Q2 2021. Apple is fast becoming a necessary service. Amazon is always there. The good news for everyone producing and distributing within the region is that we see a very strong share of demand for what we call others. It's about 25%, which is terrific. It means that the strategy of original programming in the region is working. One word of warning is when we look at that internationally, the share of global demand for original programming globally, you can see that when we've added Hulu, which isn't available in the region, when we've added HBO Max, when we've added Paramount Plus, that starts to eat into the share of other. So absolutely the strategy is working, but just be wary that the internationals are coming and they're looking at building shows within the region. I saw there was a big announcement from HBO about a show in Taiwan that they're creating as an example. Now, when we look at corporate ownership, again, we see a good news story. You can see we've put together Warner Brothers and Discovery now due to the merger. The Disney company is still #1, but the good news for everyone there is that other is increasingly capturing demand. So by corporate ownership, certainly doing a good job as well. So our thesis at Parrot is that we live in an attention economy. The fact that you're giving Lisa and I your attention for half an hour here, your attention could be on so many other different things. And it's the same in the television world. You could be looking at a mountain of other platforms, a mountain of other shows. So we've set out to measure that attention economy. We believe that if you can measure billions of those consumer engagement signals every single day, then you're able to answer some of the business's biggest business objective when it comes to content. What shows to make, what shows to market and where, which shows to sell around the world and where. So we basically built the answer to the question, what content do people want around the world? So step one of that is we capture over 2 billion people interacting with content online every single day through many different ways of looking at it, through piracy, through social video, social media, and research. Then we use our algorithm to essentially weight consumers' engagement for the amount of time they've spent engaging with each show. And then we turn that into our products and services, which are available. We map all markets, so wherever there is an IP address around the world, we're able to capture demand for TV shows. We capture about 110 different languages. So if a show is called something else in Korea, something else in American, something else in Spanish, then we'll capture it as one show. And the key point is that we are platform agnostic and very content centric. So we are able to compare shows and index shows from other platforms to each other. So let's get into it. When we add up all of our billions of demand signals that we receive every day and aggregate them over a year, this is how it breaks down. So you can read from this that 10% of our demand signals we received in this period came from the United States. Now that may not seem like much, but when you take a look at the map, you can see how it all breaks down. You can see the United Kingdom at 4.5%. You can see Canada at just about 3.6%. So this is how it breaks down. And you can see from the APAC region, the numbers look pretty low. But what we can do is that we can then drill into the APAC and the Asian region to really understand how content is being demanded. When you look at the APAC region, Australia is about 13%, China about 12%, and India about 11%. Those are the top three there. When you take out Australia and New Zealand, China rises to the top, followed by India, and then the Philippines and South Korea. So that's how the region breaks down when it comes to content demand. So what does that mean? How can you take that information and understand how the genre mix changes for APAC content demand according to which territory you're in? Well, that's what we do. So when you look at the breakdown in the APAC region, you can see compared to worldwide, that drama is fairly stable. We see generally about 40 to 42% of all the demand for television shows around the world comes from drama. You can see when we look at Asia here, that the genres that are under indexed are factual, documentary, and comedy. And the genres that over index are animation, variety, and action and adventure. So let's break that down a bit further. This looks at those 5 countries that we spoke about: China, India, the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. And you can see that when we break it down like this, it changes quite significantly. You can see there's an over-index on animation in Japan, which is no surprise with anime. There's a high over-index for drama in South Korea, which is again no surprise given the output of the drama output from South Korea. You can also see, interestingly, there's a documentary over-index in China. So there's certainly a search for factual shows going on in China. But you can see from this how the genre mix changes quite dramatically for every country that we look at here. When you deep dive into the subgenres in demand, we can really see that Japanese animation and crime dramas generate the most total demand within the APAC region, taking about 9% of the demand share each. We can also see drama, comedy, and animated content continue to be very popular. It's a general fair correlation to what we see with the global content demand. So it doesn't change too much when we look globally, but there are jumps in superhero series and mystery dramas. So that's how we map that out. So let's have a look now at what is the opportunity for Korean content in particular. Lisa's going to take you on a deep dive into Korean content and how it's perceived and travels around the world. Lisa.
Great, thanks, Steve. So we could start off with travelability of content, and travelability is how well a show travels outside of its home market. And of the 100 plus markets we track, Korea ranks in the top 20 for travelability and in the top 5 for overall demand globally. And when we look at the markets mapped in the graph, it's only surpassed by Canada, Japan, the UK, and the US, putting Korea at the top list of players globally. On the next slide, we can look at how Korean content primarily travels the best. And within the APAC region is the strongest traveled region for Korean content, with China leading the group with the highest travelability. And outside of the APAC region, US and UK have the highest demand, with the demand from the US more than doubling some of the Asian markets that we see on the list. And one theory could be that there is some correlation to how big Korean populations are in each of the markets. So some of the top countries in the list also have the highest population of Koreans outside of Korea. And on the next slide, with Korean dramas really paving the way for Korean content, you could see that the share of total demand significantly over indexes on drama versus the other genres that we see on the list. And on the right, you could see that while there are a lot of content available, only a handful outperform above the average, which shows how hard it is for content to really break through and excel. And with unscripted content, thanks to K-pop fandom globally, music varieties have extremely strong demand and also have high travelability. Whereas with scripted content, dramas are the most well-rounded and have the highest visibility. Next, we can take a closer look at a couple of top markets, starting with our top titles ranked on demand for the Philippines and Indonesia. And the index on the right of the table is benchmarked against the APAC average. So the King, which had the highest index in the Philippines, has 4 times the average APAC demand. And both markets have a very strong demand for music variety programs, with most of the available music varieties making it to the top 20 list. In general, drama is also very popular, but there are pretty big differences in the type of dramas that are in demand. Philippines preferred slightly darker dramas like Sweet Home, Penthouse, and Devil's Judge, while Indonesia had a bit more skew for romantic dramas than the counterpart. Next, we can look at the US market. And in the US, most of the content actually skews variety and drama. So there are very strong indexes that outweigh other markets, which shows like Infinite Challenge, which interesting is no longer running, and I Live Alone, making it to the top list. And on the right, this is our breakdown of demand by category. So video platform actually saw a bump, possibly from the increase of use of platforms like YouTube for marketing and previewing content by networks and distributors. And research actually saw a significant decrease, indicating that people might be moving away from traditional web pages to social media to get more information and trends from their favorite artists or pages. And this also might be an indication of an increased base awareness of Korean content to see that decrease in that sector. And next, we can look at the supply and demand of our Korean catalog within the US market. The green quadrant on the top left are subgenres, with the highest potential that have above average demand, but also lack the content to support that demand, which we consider as our opportunity areas to break through in. And the section we consider to be our more potential sales and viewing drivers. These are genres that have higher average demand, but also face a lot of competition when creating new content for. And within this section, fantasy dramas and medical dramas are two of the drivers. And on the right, you can see which titles make up that demand and how the demand skews per title. And next is our network demand. So focusing in on the largest Korean networks, the chart shows that the demand of shows, the chart shows the demand of shows individually and also the average demand of the network as a whole. And the colors indicate how saturated a network is. So the network that drives the highest demand in the US is TVN, while longer standing and older broadcast networks have the higher number of shows like KBS and NBC. The demand still skews cable networks like TVN and JTBC, which also have lower count of shows. And in the US, since live broadcasts aren't really the main source of consumption, this might suggest a more even playing field for content distributed within the US.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. So let's take a step back and look at what contributes and defines a global hit. What decides whether a hit stays within the country it's produced in or whether it goes traveling around the world. And we've done a lot of research into this at Parrot Analytics. So the first comment we always get is, we just need to get it on an international streamer to make it go worldwide. Well, you can see from this chart that that answer's not true. When we take all of our 17,500 shows that we map within our database, we can look at them as average, good, outstanding, and exceptional. It takes an incredible show to get into outstanding and exceptional. And you can see here that there are some networks whose demand per dollar is not as strong as others. So even though Netflix produce and deliver a lot of shows, it takes a lot for them to break into outstanding and exceptional. Where if you look at someone like Stars or look at Disney, which should now have a couple more purple dots in there from the Marvel universe, you can see that the demand per dollar is much higher. And HBO Max is another example of that. So it's not necessarily that you need to get it onto a global streamer. It's much more complex than that. So what we find is that different shows lend themselves to individual demand mixes. So what you're seeing here are consumption, which is our view on piracy, social video, social media, and research. And titles that exhibit more overall demand globally, we find perform very well in each one of these four buckets. There's a very evenly spread mix. Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a great example of that. You can see 35% consumption, 33% social media, and you've also got solid social video and research. You can see a couple of points in here. You can see Chernobyl, which of course, that great drama from HBO and Sky Atlantic. You can see that's almost 60% research. And we find that research skews with real life event dramas. So that is not a surprise to us seeing that skew. Also, you can see that Love Island, the UK format, skews towards social media, which makes sense because people just want to talk about it. And also Peppa Pig skews towards social video. So it's very interesting, the different mixes. Now, what's really interesting is when you look at that, when you're launching new IP around the world, because the mixture is different. So with the Queen's Gambit, initially, there was a lot of word of mouth initial spread, people talking about the show about chess, you should watch it, the characters are great. The story's really, really cool. Then we saw a lot of research on the show, people understanding how to play chess, who these characters really were, did they exist, were the competitions real? So we saw a lot of research, and then we saw piracy kick off. Then we see a big boost in piracy. So it's really interesting how new IP is discovered differently to existing IP, because something like The Crown being launched or the latest series of a Korean drama, you'll see piracy spike quite heavily because people know the IP. Whereas with unknown IP, it takes a different way to discover. We've done some research on binge or weekly drop, which is a question that the industry is asking about how they should release their content. You can see here, you've got in blue, the binge shows supply and the binge show demand. And in orange, you've got weekly show supply and weekly show demand. The key point here is that 2019 was a turning point for streamers turning away from the binge model. So this was the first time that demand for weekly release shows exceeded supply. So there was a change. Now, since then, the number of digital originals has increased that are being released on a weekly basis, but not as fast as demand is growing. So we see that the weekly release, again, is gaining a lot of traction, people understanding that they need people to engage with a show all week and talk about it and research it. And we think that's a return to the old television model of engagement. Now, you can see an example of that on here, how Amazon experimented with the release of The Expanse worldwide. So first of all, you can see season 3 there in orange was released on linear. So you can see the linear demand. Then Amazon experimented by releasing it as a binge. So you can see the initial red curve of people binging the show, and then what we call a decay curve of when people were moving on to other things. But for season 5, they released it on a weekly drop. And you can see here the spikes for the weekly drop. There was a big initial first spike. Then you can see each of the weekly spikes moving up to the finale. So there's definitely a thesis to say that if you're looking at weekly drop for shows, you're gathering more interest throughout the entire series. True in territory as well, when we look at hospital playlists and we look at Kingdom, you can see clearly here that hospital playlist that was released simultaneously has weekly peaks. And we think that that last peak at the end, at the finale, is probably people realizing that they can binge the whole series. So it's really interesting how different dropping of shows is playing out around the world. Lisa.
Yes. So on the travelability of hospital playlist, we are measuring how well the show will perform outside of Korea. So benchmarking the demand against the demand within Korea. And so in Indonesia, hospital playlist generated 28% of the demand generated from Korea. And across the board, the highest travelable markets for the show are in Asia, with the exception of the US and Brazil, which also made it to the top 10. And both still generate very strong demand for the shows. And the next slide, we can also trace the consumption affinity of the show to understand how much overlap there is between audiences. And in the last 7 days, viewers of hospital playlists are also fans of scripted Korean series across various genres, from sports-focused shows like Stove League and more romantic dramas like Mellow Is My Nature. And next, we can also look at talent demand. So similar to TV demand, we capture billions of data points from consumer activity associated with given talent to get to our talent demand. And by doing so, we can see which markets Seongjoong-gi has the highest demand in a given period of time, and comparing that demand across markets, which can also guide future casting or marketing material for the show focused into different markets. And on the right, you can see how his top markets within the year and his peak ranks in each of the top markets perform. And while he's generally more popular in Asia, there is a lot of demand globally from North and South Americas and even European countries like the UK. And next, you can see that using the demand for talent, you can also see if the demand for the shows he was in matches that talent demand. This can also imply how much weight the actors and actresses have in the performance of a show. And for Korean content, it's been pretty evident that the talent plays a huge role in the marketing and performance from a given base fandom across the globe.
Brilliant. So we hope that's given you an understanding of how we look at the world. Like, data, no one trusts one source of data alone when you make decisions. but our data is being used alongside other sources and also people's experience to really add another view to how content decisions are being made. And I hope you've seen that through this presentation. So if I took 5 takeaways from what we've spoken about, firstly, the strategy of locally produced tentpole programming within Korea and the wider region, and giving the accessibility of mobile and different monetization models is working. There's no doubt about it, but you should definitely beware the newcomers, because they're looking at eating up some of that audience share of attention when they arrive in region. When you're commissioning or thinking of green lighting, it's good to use competitive white space data analysis to see what areas, what genres you could cut through, and are going to need maybe less marketing dollars to be able to cut through to an audience that is key for your service. Thirdly, we found that you can amplify the potential of shows traveling by considering co-production initiatives. Some very successful co-pros have been done with Asian countries that are partnering using talent and directors from Western countries. And what that does is it takes 2 countries' ability for traveling shows and it superpowers them together. So that really works, looking at co-production. Choose your release schedule carefully based on how you want to engage your audience. Is this all about a binge audience and retaining your viewers on your service? Or is this more about you want to have conversation about the show and build a brand all the way through a season? So that's how you should look at release scheduling, our data suggests. And then be very aware of the genres and subgenres that are in demand when you're prioritizing your international sales. If you look at our data from that genre slide, you can see that there are certainly some genres much more in demand than other countries. So that's where your sale might have less friction. So I hope those 5 takeaways help. Thank you, Lisa, for co-presenting with me today. And the key that we always find here at Parrot is that great stories will always travel. So keep producing great stories within the region and they will travel around the world. If you've got any questions about this presentation, please do reach out. Our email addresses are on this final slide, and we will be able to send a copy of this deck out to all attendees of BCWW. Thank you for your attention, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.